Hi everyone, welcome back. This is video 2 in a series on how to create procedural pumpkins in Blender's geometry nodes. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at the first one, I'll put a link up here so you can check that out. This video will demonstrate how to procedurally unwrap the pumpkins we created last time, and also how to apply a material that can be adjusted through the geometry nodes input. I was hoping to get this video out sooner, but what can I say, life is hectic. So I'll stop wasting your time and let's get started. All right, before we get too far into this, let's take a look at where we left off last time. We've got our pumpkin model here, and all we're doing in this tutorial, we're just going to apply a material to this pumpkin, and the first step to that is actually to get a texture coordinate set up. So we're going to set up basically a UV unwrap. We're going to have an X coordinate that goes around the perimeter, and then we'll have a Y coordinate that comes up this side. So to do that, let's go back. We're going to go to the shading tab here. And let's bring this up, make some more space for our node setup. And I'm going to get rid of this attribute that we brought in last time. And while I'm here, let's switch over to rendered view, and I'm going to change to cycles for the render engine and switch this over to GPU compute. And the first thing we're going to do, let's bring in a texture coordinate here. Give us some space over here. And we'll start with the object coordinate. And the first thing we're going to do is set up the X coordinate that goes around in a circle. So let's go from our object coordinate, we'll go to a separate XYZ. Bring this X up to an arctan 2. And also connect in our Y coordinate. And then we can actually Control-Shift-Click and see where this is going. So we've got that radial dimension going from -pi to pi. So we'll bring in a map range because I actually want that going from 0 to 1. So we change this from min to -pi and from max to pi. Now we're going from 0 around to 1. And that actually gives us what we want for our X coordinate. So now for the Y coordinate, we're just going to use this Z. So let's bring in a combine XYZ. And we're going to plug this Z straight into the Y coordinate for that combine XYZ. And then to test this, let's bring in a image texture. And we're just going to generate a new image for this. So let's click new, and I'm going to rename this to grid. And then the generated type, we're going to use UV grid. I click OK. You can see what we've got. Let's focus on that and take a look at what we've done. So we have this grid here, and you can see it's converging to a point right up here, which is exactly what we want. The problem is, you see we've got our stem over here, and our grid is not converging anywhere near the stem, which means these vertical lines are actually going to come up across the ridges that we made in our model. Let me actually connect this so you can see a little bit better. Put that to the principled BSDF. Control-Shift-Click. There, that gives you a slightly better look at it. So you can see our stem over here and our coordinate system converging over here. So we're going to fix that in our geometry nodes, because the reason why it looks like that, if we get rid of this macro distortion that we made and also this bend, now you can see that coordinate system actually centers right on the middle of that stem. So if we go back before our distortion setup and before this bend setup, then we can actually make some space and get our XYZ coordinate or UV coordinate from there. Because if you remember, see if I Alt-Shift-Click on this node here, at this point we had a symmetrical pumpkin that was perfectly centered on our coordinate system. I'm actually going to undo that. Alt-Shift-click. So now, if I go in here, we'll add a store named attribute. Set that up there. We'll make this a vector attribute, and we can just rename this XYZ. And for the value, we're just going to plug in the position. So we'll plug that in right there, and I'm going to jump back to our shading workspace. Get rid of this texture coordinate, and we'll just bring in our attribute and call this XYZ. Connect that to the vector. And now it actually doesn't look much different than it did a second ago, but if we add in, let's add in some of this macro distortion, and we'll bring this bend angle back to 0.2. And now you can see even with those changes, it retains the same XYZ coordinate system and just bends that coordinate system so that now our coordinate system is still converging right at the center of that stem. And also at the bottom, you can see it converges right at the center of the base as well. The problem you can see pretty well down here is with the Z coordinate now. You can see as it comes down the side, because we're just using the straight vertical coordinates for our Y coordinate on the UV unwrap, it crosses the center of this cross here, goes down a little bit, and actually crosses it in the other direction on the way up. If I go to the side view, you can kind of see what's going on. So because our pumpkin geometry goes around and comes back up, it's just using that same Z coordinate. So we need to make some adjustments for that as well. Jump back to the geometry node setup here. And make some space. So let's bring in let's do a separate XYZ. And we'll also do a combine XYZ. Because the X and Y coordinates are actually working out just fine. So we'll leave those connected. And then we'll move these over here. Because all we need to do is fix that Z coordinate. And what we're going to do, if you look, let's go to the right side orthographic. So the pumpkin is more or less a sphere. It's not perfect, but we don't actually want anything to be perfect. It would look a little unnatural. But what we can do is treat that as a sphere for our UV unwrap. And we'll bring in, we'll create a center point here and do the same radial coordinate system going up and around the side here, the same way we did for the X coordinate that went around. So let's first establish that center point and fix our Z coordinates so they respect that center point halfway up. The center point, we can just use a group input and take the height divided by 2. So we'll just go right there, divide by 2. And then we just need to adjust our Z coordinates by whatever that center point is. So we'll take our Z and subtract this center point from that. And that will actually be one part of that arctan 2. Now for the other part, we can't just use the Y coordinate the way it looks like here. We also can't just use the straight X coordinate. What we need to do is figure out how far each one of the points we're using is from the center of our pumpkin. So we're just going to figure out what this length is. So if we go down here, we'll bring our position node and connect it to a vector math node. Switch this to multiply. And I'm not concerned with the Z coordinate of our position. All I want to know is the X and Y. And we'll take this to another vector math. We'll do a length node. We should be able to just plug that straight into our arctan 2. And as per usual, we'll just take this to a map range and do a negative pi to pi. And then I think if we just plug this straight into our Z coordinate here, now you can see we've got that stretching resolved. Bring that full screen. So you can see we're not stretching as we go over the top. The coordinates as they go up the stem are a little bit stretched right now. We're actually going to address that separately later. But for now, you can see the vertical lines as they go around the outside of that pumpkin align pretty well with the ridges that we made. So that should be exactly what we want. Let's go over here. I'm going to straighten this out. Put a frame around this, Control J, and we'll rename this XYZ. Now that we have our coordinate system established, we can go back to our shading workspace and start applying material to this. So first, let's get rid of this grid. We don't need that anymore. I'm going to move these over a little ways, and let's put a frame around this and rename this pumpkin coordinates. And let me bring in a reference so we can look at what we're planning to do here. Basically, I want to create 3 different textures for this. We're going to have this dark green kind of texture with these lighter colored streaks coming up the side. And we're going to do something like this pale faded pumpkin down here, and then we'll do the standard, classic orange pumpkin. So let's start with this green texture here. And we're going to create those streaks using a Musgrave texture. I'm going to go in here. We're going to leave the scale where it is. We're going to bring the detail up to 10 so that you can see the split there. But if we bring this dimension down, bring that down to 0.01, you can barely see that join at that's the 0 point for our texture coordinates that you were seeing. But now, let's see. We got 2 issues with this. For one, it's basically split 50-50 between white and black, and it's also not stretched. So let's address that stretching first. We'll bring in a vector math node, plug it in here, and change this to multiply. And we only have an x and a y coordinate, so let's bring those both to 1. And if you bring this x coordinate up, it'll compress that x coordinate. And if we do 3, you can see it's pretty well stretched along that y there. So now I'm going to bring in do a mix RGB, plug that in over here. I actually want to do something that will allow us to control the color, the base color of our pumpkin from our geometry node input. So let's hop back to geometry nodes for just a second. And right over here, right before our group input, I'm going to bring in, or that's our group output, sorry, I'm going to bring in a group input. And we're going to add another input down here at the bottom. We're going to call this base color. And I'm just going to plug that straight into the output. Actually, before I go any further, let's change this type to color, which unfortunately means I'm also going to have to change the type down here. So to change the type on the output to color as well. And then expand this output attributes on your geometry nodes panel and rename this base color to base color. Otherwise, you won't be able to actually access that attribute in the shading tab. So now if we switch back to shading, I'll bring in an attribute node. And we'll take this color 1 and plug it into the color and make this base color. And now I should be able to adjust my color from over here. So let's bring the value up a little bit. And we'll make this our dark green color. And then for this color 2, I want to bring in kind of a yellow color, and I'm going to bring the value up to, say, 0.7. And we'll leave the saturation all the way up at 1. But again, you can see we're split kind of 50-50 between our two colors there. Let's use a map range to just kind of bring up the amount of that green. So if you bring this, actually if we bring this from min up to 1, you can see it gets rid of the yellow entirely. But if we bring that down a little bit and just let a little bit of that yellow come through, now you can see we've mostly got green, but we've got some pretty big streaks of yellow in there. I'm actually going to bring this down to 0.3, so it's not quite as harsh a difference between the two. That should be a decent start for that dark texture. Let's see what that looks like when it's plugged into the principled BSDF. I think that looks pretty good. So let's move on. We'll see what we can do with our faded texture next, that desaturated pumpkin, this one down here. What we want to do for this one is basically just bring in kind of some spots of saturated color that'll offset the mostly desaturated pale color. So let's bring in, we're going to use a Voronoi texture for this. Put that right there. And I'll Control-Shift click so we can see what we're looking at. Let's bring the scale up to 50 to start with. If I zoom in, what you can see is there's kind of a harsh line between each one of those cells on that texture. So we're just going to use smooth F1 so that it's not quite as drastic between them. And actually I want to bring this up to 500. And I'm going to use another mix RGB. So we'll Shift D, duplicate that, and I'm going to plug this distance into the factor. But I don't want to just mix the color. What I actually want is we're going to use just the saturation. And let's change this base color again. Let's bring it to kind of a desaturated color, and we'll bring the value way up. So now I think you can kind of see what we're going for. Doesn't need to be exact on the color, but I'm actually going to bring this saturation down. Let's do 0.8 for the saturation. And again, I want more of my base color to show through, so we're going to do the same thing. Let's bring in another map range. And I'm going to bring this from min up, and you can see we're getting more and more of that base color. I'm going to set this around 0.4. And that should actually be pretty good for that faded pumpkin texture. Let's bring this base color around to our typical pumpkin texture. So with that orange color, you can see we've got some of that desaturated color coming through. We've also got some of our base, that yellow color coming through. That looks pretty good, but the thing I want to adjust now, if you look at this reflection, it still looks way too smooth for a natural pumpkin. So we're going to take a look at what we can do to change that. I'm going to start with just taking this Voronoi texture. We're going to go straight over to a bump node. We're going to go to the height. And I'm going to plug that straight into our normal down here. And obviously that's a little too strong. So let's bring this way down. I'm going to go 0.05 and I'm going to go 0.02 on the distance. And now it looks a little better. It's definitely rougher, but it's still kind of uniform in my opinion. So I want to bring in another texture just to add some more distortion to that. Let's bring in just a noise texture. And we're going to change the scale on that, bring that up to 50, and I think I want this detail up as well. So we'll go to 6 on the detail. And bring in a map range and adjust this so we're going from 0.25 to 0.75. And that's just to crush that difference so that you get more of a variation between the dark and the light. And Shift D, duplicate this bump node. Make sure this is plugged into the height and not the normal. And then we can take this normal and plug it into the normal of our first bump node. And Control Shift click, make sure we're actually looking at that principled BSDF. Now if we zoom in a little bit, and I want to bring this strength up to 0.1. And now if you switch back and forth, it's pretty subtle, but I think it makes a big difference in the way that texture actually reads on the screen. So that should be good for our texture. Next we'll look at the stem, but before we do that, bring this over. We'll put this all in a frame and call this pumpkin texture. We've got our pumpkin textured, but if we go around here and look towards the top, you can see the stem is still the same color, the same texture as the rest of the pumpkin, which honestly is a little disturbing. So let's bring in, actually let's duplicate this principled BSDF. We'll bring this down here, Control Shift click, and I want to make this kind of a brown color to stand in for the stem. And we'll bring in a mix shader up here. And we'll connect our pumpkin to the top input and our stem to this lower input here. And then we just need something to adjust that factor. And if you remember, in our geometry node setup, we actually created a stem mask. So let's bring in that stem mask here and see if that'll work. So we take this factor here, plug it right into the factor on the mix shader, and you can see that doesn't line up anywhere near where our actual stem starts. So we need something else to control the changeover between our pumpkin and our stem. Let's go back to the geometry node setup. I'm going to go all the way back to the start of our geometry node tree in this exponential stem frame here. Right before we do the set position, I'm going to add in another store named attribute. And we're going to call this stem factor. And the idea is we're going to go from 0 at the base of the stem up to 1 at the tip. And we have already a node here that takes the z coordinate from the position from 0 to 1. Unfortunately, that actually goes from 0 at the top of the stem to 1 at the bottom. So all we need to do, we're going to take that to a subtract node over here. Plug that into the bottom input, and for this top value, we're just going to use 1. So all this is going to do is reverse it. So now it's going from 0 at the base to 1 at the top. And let's go back to our shading workspace. We'll switch this over to stem factor. So now we have at the very top of the stem, it's fully stem shader. All the way at the bottom, it's fully pumpkin shader. So we're going to need to bring in a map range. And if we just bring our from max down, you can see it's starting that stem shader lower and lower. So let's just bring this to 0.1. We zoom in a little bit. We can see that isn't hitting quite at the base of the stem. It just does a nice gradient into the stem texture. just slightly above that crease there. So that should actually work pretty well, and it doesn't give us like a hard edge like you would get if you just did a straight factor from 0 to 1, or a Boolean, like that stem mess would have given us anyway. So now that we have that changeover set up, we can go down here and start working on a bit of a stem shader. So this coordinate system that we use for the pumpkin will actually work fairly well for our stem as well. So let's highlight all that stuff. Shift D, copy it down here. And I'm just going to rename this real quick. And we'll call this stem coordinates. And to start with, I just want to have a noise texture here, just to blend some different colors in for our stem texture. But right away, you can see there's a slight problem. And we talked about this before. It looks like this Z coordinate, or the Y coordinate, I guess, on the stem itself gets kind of stretched. So I'm going to reuse that same stem factor that we just created. So let's go in here. We're going to rename this one stem factor. And I'm going to plug that factor straight into the Y coordinate on that combine XYZ. And now you can see it flattens that out a little bit. And we can use that as our texture coordinate for the stem. I'm going to go from the color because basically that gives me 3 noise textures for the price of 1, basically. So let's go to a separate XYZ. And I'm going to use this X value from that. We're going to go to a mix RGB. Plug that into the factor. And I'm just going to select a couple of kind of dark green colors. Just copy that down and maybe make it a little bit darker, just so we have some variation there. And then I'm going to go down here and we'll plug in our Y coordinate. Control Shift click, and then I'm going to do basically the same thing, just with a couple of brown looking textures. Copy that and make it a little bit darker. And that's just for some variation. Now, I want to take and see, we'll duplicate another one of these mix RGBs and connect both of these, because I want to have a way to kind of combine these 2 colors together. And we'll use a Musgrave to do that. Let's go down here, bring in a Musgrave texture. And I'm going to plug this height right into the factor on our mix RGB over here. And let's bring this scale up. Bring that scale up to 20. And bring the detail up to, let's say, 8. And bring this dimension down. We'll do 0.5 for the dimension. And then I kind of want this to be stretched a little bit along that Z coordinate, or sorry, I keep saying Z, that the Y coordinate of the stem. So let's bring in a vector math node. We'll plug that in. Make sure you change this to multiply. And I want to do 1 for the X and Y. And then see if I bring this X up, it compresses that a little bit, but I actually want it stretched more along that Y coordinate. So if I bring the Y, bring that down, yeah, that looks better. So let's bring that to, not to 2, to 0.2, so that it's stretched a little bit along that Y coordinate. And then let's connect this to our principled BSDF. It's getting kind of hard to see what we're dealing with. definitely need to bring the roughness down a little bit. Let's bring this to, actually up to 0.7, so it's not quite so shiny. There you can see you mostly have green on that stem with some brown streaks mixed in a little bit. I'm going to bring in another map range. I want to change this just a little bit. Bring this from min, actually. Yeah, I want a little bit more brown in there. So I'm going to bring that from max down to 0.7. Because it brings a little bit more brown in there. And then, let's see. Next thing I want to do, I want to add some more texture to that stem, because right now it's looking a little flat. So let's take from that Musgrave, we'll just go straight down. We'll go to a bump node, go down, we'll make that the height input, and connect that straight over to the normal on our principled BSDF. I'm going to bring this strength down. Let's go to 0.4. Then we can have 0.1 for the height, or for the distance. You can see that just gives us some bumpiness to the stem itself. And I also want to change, so if we bring in, go make a little bit more space here. Want to take from our stem factor, bring that to a map range over here. And if I Control-Shift-Click here, remember this is going from 0 to 1. If I bring this from minimum up to 0.95, you can see we're just isolating the very top of that stem. I'm going to take that to a math node over here. We're just going to add onto that map range that we had before. So this is that Musgrave texture. And if I just add our mask here to the top, now you can see right at the top of that, we've got that isolated. So now when we go to our mix shader, you can see we've just kind of isolated that very top, made it just that brown color. I don't know, it just kind of makes it look like it's been freshly cut. So it has a little different texture than the rest of that stem. Then one more thing I want to do, when we change between our different textures, I want that base color to affect the stem color just a little bit. So if you look, when we go over to this desaturated pumpkin, I want that to affect the stem color a little bit. So let's bring in another attribute input. We'll make this our base color. And we're going to plug that in. Let's do another mix RGB. And I'll take this color to the second input, or base color to the second input. And let's just make this the saturation. And I want it to be kind of a subtle change, so let's bring it down. We'll do 0.4. And that way you can see when we bring this back to our very saturated orange pumpkin, it brings that saturation up for the stem. And if you bring it down, let's go to our dark green pumpkin, it's still going to be a little bit saturated, but you can see it takes on kind of the characteristics of the rest of the pumpkin. Just so you have some variation when you change the base color. And one more thing, speaking of variation, so if you have several pumpkins next to each other with this this base Musgrave, these streaks showing through, it's kind of going to be obvious if they're all the same. So let's go back. I want to look at this pumpkin texture one more time. And we're going to make a slight change to this. Let's change this main Musgrave texture up here in the pumpkin texture. We'll change this to a 4D. And then I'm going to make a little bit more space here. Bring in another attribute node. And I want to plug in, I need to go, before I do this, we got to go back to our geometry node setup. And again, right before the output, so we're going to take this seed and connect that to the output. And then same as we did for the base color, just rename that seed, and then we'll be able to access that in our shading workspace. Change this attribute name to seed and plug this factor in as the W. That way, as we change this seed on our input, you should see that texture itself, the color variation, will also change along with that seed. So that way when you have multiple pumpkins in the same image, you won't be able to match the texture of the colors to each other. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. I haven't decided what I'm going to do in the next one, so if you have anything you'd like to see, let me know. As always, feel free to leave a comment and show off your work. I love to see it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.